Good evening and welcome to the Town of Millis Finance Committee meeting. This is Thursday, February 20th. I'm Jody Garzon, the chair, and I'll have us introduce ourselves.
Sean Power.
Craig Schultz.
Pete Berube. Doug Riley.
Kathy McInnes.
Katie, too.
Jim Borgman.
Tonight, we are going to we're going to talk about the municipal and school department revenue split, and then just do some council business, and then that shall be it. So, Craig, you want to lead us off?
All right, I sent out the spreadsheet, and that's included in the package for the first 5 years. I didn't make it so small we couldn't read it. I'm trying to be respectful. But the first 5 years are in the spreadsheet that was handed out. The next 5 years are on the email. Really, after last week, we discussed 3 different scenarios that I heard pretty clearly. And there might be subtle differences and like version 1A, 1B, 1C, but 3 basic different scenarios. The first was use the 65-35 split. The second one was to use the 4% cap that I had proposed. And the third one was put all of the new revenue that Glen Ellen generates as taxes into capital projects or not use it in operating budgets at all. There were other things that were discussed, and as I looked at them, they're great ideas. They just won't make a difference on this project, on this piece of the project. I think assigning healthcare and benefits costs to the departments makes a lot of sense, but it's not going to change how we allocate the money starting out, because we would just basically net up both of those 2 departments for a starting point. So that added some complexity to it. And there's a few other pieces with the departmental budgets. The health insurance is not actually negotiated by the town. I don't believe it's the GIS. Is that correct, Mike?
GIC.
GIC. That's close. GIC. So that's a group we joined 10, 15 years ago.
About 8, 9 years ago.
All right, 10.
Yeah.
Yeah. 10 years ago, and it got us a better rate than we were able to negotiate on our own. So we don't negotiate those rates, they're told to us. And that's the reason why it was put above the line originally, since it's not something we negotiate, it's not something we control, but by the same token, if we put it into the budgets and then just allowed it to grow at whatever the negotiated rate was, as separate from the 4%, then the departments would own their headcount changes.
Right.
Which would make sense. But that made it far more complicated than I had time to do between last meeting and this meeting, especially with all 3 different scenarios.
Right.
So looking the 3 scenarios over, the existing 65-35 split, it gives us really good and I'm going to start off by saying, if I'm wrong, if we don't have this extra revenue coming in, then we just kind of go with the idea behind a traditional revenue split until we do solve that problem, is my suggestion. But I came at this, let me start where I came at it from. I came at it from really 3 goals. I wanted to fund level services for the next 10 years. In my head, 10 years seemed like a reasonable stuff. And level service is an important consideration, because that means we're providing the same services to people for whatever cost escalators are built into contracts. We're not able to add new positions, we're not able to add new things, but we don't have to make cuts. So level service basically means no cuts. My thought is if you go beyond level service, that's, and I'm not advocating for one, but that's where the override comes in. That's the idea behind Prop 2.5. People have a say if they want their taxes to go up for council on aging, for schools, for police. So that's why I thought level service was a goal. Second goal is to set aside any surplus funds for capital, because I thought our capital is woefully lacking. I think that the roads, driving down Spring Street, I think having money for roads is critical. And we just don't have that right now. And then the third goal I had was provide a known and stable and predictable growth rate for the departments. If you're telling the departments they can grow by X% each year, it gives them something they can plan with. So the 65-35 split, going back to option 1, that gives us really decent revenue growth in the first year, 5% revenue growth. 4.2% in the third year, to 4.18, 4.14. It's over 4% until we get to FY27. And the sheet that's been handed out stops at FY25, but if the worksheet, it goes out to FY30. You know? But it doesn't set any money aside for capital. So there's no money going into capital. We're literally spending every dollar we get in on operations, which would be great. It'll let us grow beyond level service. But as you get out to future years, we're going to have to start cutting because that growth that we've built in by adding those positions, adding those people, we now won't have that sustainable revenue source. So it didn't pass my sustainability question. It wasn't a sustainable level. And also it wasn't predictable. I'm sure that the school and the municipal departments would love to have a 5% growth next year. But if we do that, then we're not going to be able to sustain that. We're going to have to make cuts in the future. I'm going to jump down to the bottom option, option number 3, which was take all of the Glen Ellen revenue and put it towards capital projects, or not use it in budgets. However it's used, it's not used in budgets. This one's really attractive because it'll give us about $21 million of capital funds over the next 10 years, but it allows budgets to grow at less than 2.5% each year. And 2.5% is unsustainable. 2.5% means we're going to have to be making cuts to budgets. You need to have at least 3.25 and probably more like 4 to have a sustainable budget, just because of contract negotiations, not adding positions. A sustainable level service budget is about 4%. So I, in my mind, ruled that one out because I loved having the money for capital, but it was at the expense of all the operations. We can have great roads and great buildings, but we won't have services to offer in those buildings if we do that. So going back to the 4% model, and I set it up so it could play with different ratios, different numbers, 4%, 4.5%. As you started growing it, obviously the future years get worse. But this gave us about $4.4 million for capital projects over 10 years. And it funded 9 years of growth at 4%. The 10th year gets a little dicey, but FY30 is 10 years away. We'll have time to come up with that and plan for it. You could reduce that impact if you would put some of the money, some of that $4.4 million into stabilization with the idea to use it for year 10. So there are ways it could be, and stabilization is just the town savings account. So if we were to put $100,000 a year for the next, at some point for 3 or 4 years, that would probably plug the gap that we have on year 10. So there's discussions that can be had at later dates about how we do that. The thing I liked about it was really taking, in effect, most of the revenue as the Glen comes on and other new growth comes on and putting it towards capital. It's not compounding it like option 3 does, where all of the Glen revenue goes in, but it's really given us a $4.4 million run at capital projects or whatever else is needed for the town. It could be anything that comes before this committee, the selectmen and the school committee that they decide they'd like to pursue, whether it's routine maintenance or preventative maintenance at the high school to avoid, to push the need for a full rehab off years. It could be road work. It could be just about anything we think of that we'd like to consider. If it doesn't hit operating budgets, it gives us the years out to work on it. So that's the executive recap of this. I'm obviously proposing option 2, which is the 4%. And if I'm wrong, and if we get more than 4%, we just set more aside for roads. And if I'm wrong, we get less than 4%, then we go back to just an even distribution, and it's no worse than the previous years. So it's, and we'll know these numbers as we get the tri-county number, the health insurance benefits number. We're getting most of our numbers in. So as we get the rest of the numbers, we'll have a more concrete place of where we land. So that's basically the presentation. I'm open for questions.
So if we were to move the insurance and benefits into the respective budgets, I know you've played around with it a little bit, but not extensively. Would that throw off that 4% growth rate for each of them?
It would, because we have health insurance growing at 5%, benefits growing at 5% now. I would suggest if we do this, and this is why I couldn't do it in the 3 different models. First off, I'm a volunteer and I get paid to do something else, so I had to do my real job. But I would say you set up 2 tiers. You have a 5% growth or contractual allowable growth based on whatever contract we get from GIS.
See.
Do we have it yet? Have they come out with the number yet?
Yeah.
GIC, no.
No?
I don't believe so. We
Yeah.
don't have the actual percentage
Yeah.
yet.
So once we get that number, I would say that's the allowable growth, and if there's headcount changes, that comes out of their 4%. So there's ways to make it work, but we aren't really there yet, but I think that it could be done once we settle on one scenario.
Okay. Yeah, that was,
And I started allocating a little bit on the other page. Basically, it would take the school from 15,857,000 to
Yep.
19,116,000, and the municipal from 7,809 to 9,691. And Carol was great. She got me the retirement and the health.
Yeah.
But the life, other bit, and life insurance, the other benefits, I needed to go through and take all the revenue for each department and multiply it by the Medicare. I just didn't have time to do that, so I just assumed a 65-35, which ironically is quite close to what the other splits came out to.
but, you know, a $5 million
Yeah.
expense, you know, dumping it into the budgets is a lot. And particularly if it's growing at a faster clip than the other budgets, which it historically has
Right.
been. It could throw off that 4%. I could
And that's
see
why
where
you'd have
that
to have
would be a
separate line.
challenge, yeah.
You'd have to have a separate line to allow it to grow at whatever the contractual rate is.
Yep.
If we get a great year and it's 3%, it's only allowed to grow at 3%. If we get a
Hey,
bad year, it grows
we'll
at
throw a party, 'cause it'll be a
8%, we're allowed
miracle.
to grow at 8%.
Yeah,
But it's not going to change the basic concept behind it.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems like it makes sense to leave it as is.
I've done some work on this, I want to, no, I agree with you.
No, because if you're just gonna create two tiers
Right.
and separate it out, then you're effectively just going back around in a circle again and netting out.
Yeah,
You know?
the only reason I do think it makes some sense, and Kathy was right, if we do have headcount changes, which are controlled by the department, then it's not split on that 65-35
Right.
split.
Right.
Yep.
So I
That's a
think
good
there
point.
is a benefit to it, and I think once we settle on a scenario, I can plug that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of how I'm thinking, just because it creates greater ownership
Yeah.
of the headcount and the costs for every employee within the different departments.
Yeah.
But it is a challenge because it's growing at a faster rate than, and we can't control it.
And I would consider, just as another possible idea, is including Tri-County in with the school budget too, because theoretically, that would provide incentive to recruit more for kids staying at the high school instead of going to Tri-County, you know, but I'm just throwing that out there too. So there's things we can look at. We can play around with those ideas and see what they look like.
Isn't that complicated though by the fact that, you know, it's a question of how much control they, you know, how much ability they do have to influence, and number two, the lag time.
Yeah.
Like, we've had years where we've gotten the Tri-County assessment and when we didn't realize.
Yeah.
Right, why is this so big? It's because, 2 years ago, there was a huge group of, and so,
And I'm not advocating for it necessarily, but it's something I looked at and thought we could consider if we needed to. I was just trying to come up with some outside-the-box ideas based on the last meeting we had.
Yeah.
Sure, I'm listening.
Other questions?
What are the arguments against using Model 3 or allocation Model 3, and where there is funds, where you say funds available for capital projects, rather than, I think my intent or kind of the line of questioning last week was not so much setting aside or allocating that necessarily to funds for capital projects, but then competing those requirements that are on the next year's budget for that money. In other words, if there were capital projects or, I don't want to say above service level budget requests, but budget requests that are above the growth rate as you have it presented here, then that could be considered in either a year's article, a budget article, so that there is funds available. I mean, having seen the capital requirements, there's many of them, millions and millions of dollars.
4 million doesn't seem like much.
4 million doesn't seem like much. My fear is that if all or most of the money goes to budget growth, whether that's level service, inflationary budget growth, that the next time that there's a capital requirement, now you're talking basically an override situation where the townspeople feel compelled or forced into a vote, much like we had with the new Clyde Brown School.
I would say that we're not talking about being able to even maintain level service with the numbers in allocation number 3. A 2.4% growth in your budget doesn't, I mean, there's no way that any department can operate with a 2.4% growth. So, and we can quibble whether 4%, 3.8, 3.9, but it's something far closer to 4% than it is 2.4%.
Can we discuss that a little further?
Sure.
And I'd just like to hear maybe from Mike or Terry about, what is the average year? Because again, these contracts, for instance, most of this growth, my perception is that growth comes from union renegotiation or negotiations of contracts. Is that a straight line, or is that a bit up and down based on every 3-year? I get it, there's steps and wages and bumps that are already in the schedule, but then there's a contract renegotiation. What can we expect? What does the data show?
Thank you. Mike Kaczynski, Town Administrator. I think it mostly, from my perspective on personnel and the costs associated with personnel, because we have systems based on steps and negotiated COLAs or wage adjustments, however you want to look at it, there is kind of a tiered step system that mostly, I think, varies through changes in staff. So if you have staff leave, staff retire, new staff coming on, they come in at step 1 versus leaving at step 10. That's the big change. But during that step period, the average increase with steps, COLAs, lanes, longevity, that can go up in the 3.5% to 4% range. So I think that's where that comes in. You do have years where it's not as high because you have employees leaving and new ones coming in. So I'll let Terry talk a little more about the school.
Yeah, because we have a couple more unions. But just to extend on that, so for example, when you have steps and lanes, you have a couple of different things going on. So first off, just with a basic steps situation, you could have a 2% increase in the budget in the schedule. But if you also have 2% steps, that means that if somebody is moving on steps, not moving on lanes, just moving on steps, they're going to get a 4% increase in that given year. Now, if they also move on, go ahead.
And if we can, I understand that. I understand it could happen. I'm asking you to forecast.
Well,
what will happen?
Well, it will happen, because they always move, if they're on steps, they will move on steps.
Retirements and things like that, but what is it projected to happen? Nobody leaves. What is is it a flat line? Is there an average? Is there real data that you can forecast on?
I would tell you that typically speaking in the schools, you're going to be talking about between 3 1/3 and 4% on average with the salaries. I mean, typically where we're trying to make up ground is on the expense side to try and keep it at the 4%. But we also will run into situations, and I'll grant you these are unique situations, but for example, with our transportation union this year, quite frankly, it's very hard to find bus drivers. So we had to restructure that whole schedule. And that whole schedule went up dramatically, more in the scheme of 20%. Okay, now granted, it's a small group, but if you are not competitive, then you will find from time to time you have to make corrections. But I would say that's an outlier, not a norm. So, but I would say on average, if you were to look at all the salaries together, you're looking at, in any given year, you're looking for just the COLAs and steps, you're looking at 3 1/3 to 4%. Now again, there will be people that move on lanes, and for example, this year, if everybody moves on lanes that has put in to move on lanes, that's close to $200,000 right there.
For a second, a lane is when somebody moves from an undergraduate degree to a master's plus 2.
Correct.
And that's not on the municipal side. Yeah, so that's only.
That's unique to the school side, and it's unique to teachers.
Yeah.
That would be that would really be the only group that we have that would move on what we call lanes or columns.
And I will say that the school, because I'm privy to their stuff, just because I've seen it in that book, and they do have the lanes and all those things very well detailed. The town does too, but I have to look through many more departments than just one sheet. So it's very easy to look at in that one. And they've been very good contemplating who's making a lane change, who's making a step change, and who's making a third one, lane step
Lane-
and cost of living. So they've been able
Cost
to
of living,
control
COLA.
that. So in years when they don't have a lot of people looking at lane changes, they've been able to go higher on the other ones to keep the total cost reasonable.
Now, the good news is as you look at this thing in a long-term sense, when you're looking at salaries, is that we do have people that stay. So eventually, they get to the top of
Yeah.
the top of the column, and then it becomes whatever the increase is. So it stabilizes at 2%. Seeing how I'm here talking, the concern, I guess, we have, and this is where, and I think there's been provisions in Craig's proposal for this to happen, is that the thing we can't control that is starting to develop in this town is growth. And growth means adding staff. And that would be it's not going to happen in the next couple of years, but like just today, I got something from the planning board for a development of 43 units? So
And
that's-
the view with that is that's why it's reassessed every 3 years.
Right.
To see what the right percentage is. Just because I've used 4% to start with right now, that's what looks right today. If 43 more units come on, if more projects come on, we can look at different numbers.
Well, I think it's important to highlight that this isn't a plan to set in stone forever and never touch again.
No, and I thought when I heard that, I thought that was the most important thing I heard when it was first proposed is, let's review this every 3 years. I think that's a tremendous idea, whatever
We have
the
a
committee
lot of different
decides.
projects in flux right now, which is great. 3 years ago, when we were looking at the town budget and forecasts, we were trying to figure out how we were going to even provide level service
Right.
without growth, if Glen Ellen wasn't really going to come on board. So at least now we're looking at how are we going to manage growth to the benefit of all town departments and capital expenses that we know we need to address.
So, question for Terry. When I looked at some of the data that was sent out, and I focused just on salaries and expenses, and on the school side, I came out with sort of an average annual increase of approximately 4.3%, which is higher than the 4% than we're talking about, but it's a good ballpark. Does that sound about right to you?
Again, I'd have to go back and look at the numbers. It could be, because one of the things we've been working on is trying to, when we renegotiate with these groups, is to also restructure the steps. So, for example, I mentioned the transportation group as an example. We did adjust, we did a concept of dropping and adding steps to bring them up, but while we did that, the trade-off was we made the steps 2%. So in the long term, what's going to happen is that schedule's going to level out. And so where we can with these groups, and you can't necessarily do it with all the groups, and of course, the teachers are the biggest groups, is we're trying to reduce what those steps are. In the past, there's been some I won't say overly large steps compared to other districts. They're actually fairly in line with other districts, but they may be 3% steps. So now instead of let's say it was a 2% increase or a 2.5% increase, and now it's a 3% step, well, now you're talking 5.5% increase for that particular staff person. So to take that all together and say that it averages out over 4%, that's very possible. I'd have to run the numbers, but very
And
possible.
The other piece is that.
That was good, by the way. I was expecting it to be worse.
Yeah.
So, good job.
Yeah, and I think that also we do have school choice funds and other funds that come in. We're talking,
Right.
because this 4%, to be clear, will be higher than we've given either the municipal or the schools in the last several years. Last 3 years, I think. Last year was below 4, and I know the two prior to that were below 4. So if they can grow by 4.3 with the school choice and those other funds that they come in and they get from the state, and the grants that the town gets that are beyond what we budget from the operating budgets. I'm talking about the use of tax revenue, state aid, and that money coming in, growing by 4%.
Terry, I don't know that.
Right over
everybody
here,
knows.
Joycey.
Getting that casual now, Kathy?
Terry, I don't know that everybody in the audience knows who you are, so if you wouldn't, I mean, I know they said school side, and we know.
Been a long day, I'm not sure I know who I am.
Yeah,
My name's
I-
Terry Wigan, I'm the business manager for the Millis Public Schools, and
Okay.
very, very happy to have the privilege to do so.
He didn't just wandering off the street.
No,
I didn't.
no, he just decided he would comment on school budgets off the top of his head.
Well, it's just that not everybody knows,
True.
so we all have to identify
And
ourselves, so.
and I guess just for the record, I've only been doing it here for a little under 2 years, but I've been doing what I do for over 25.
So when it comes to steps, approximately, like, what's the time period in between?
1 year.
So every year it
Yes.
goes up until
Every year,
it's
somebody
like
would
a-
move a step, if they are eligible.
Okay,
And there are, typically speaking, if somebody is employed for the year, then they are eligible to move a step. But for example, if someone goes out on a leave, then they would not be eligible to move on a step. They would remain on that same step until they complete their next year of employment, and then they would move on the step. So there are things that would freeze somebody on a step in certain circumstances.
And lanes are much less frequent.
Lanes are
Right,
much less
because
frequent.
that's educational.
Yes, right. You have to achieve certain educational requirements.
And approximately how many steps are there?
I think there are 14 on the teachers, and that's the most that we would have in any contract.
Wow.
Yeah.
How many are in the town? 8?
Usually 10.
10?
Yeah.
Every contract's a little different, but 10 would be the norm.
Yeah.
Pretty sweet with the schools.
Other questions?
Perhaps, maybe you can explain what I know you said the steps. I'll talk into the mic.
There you go.
I know you said that there are 14 steps. What does the first step start at?
I want to say, I wish I'd brought my book with me if I'd known I was going to have that many CBA questions. Actually, I do have my computer with me, but I want to say it's for a B1, it's in the $50,000 range, plus or minus.
What's B1?
Bachelor's degree,
Thank you.
okay? If I were to guess, I want to say 53, but I'm not sure about that right now.
So what would
I
step?
can pull out my computer and look
No,
it
that's
up if
fine.
you'd
Just,
like.
I'm not going to hold you exact.
Yeah.
Maybe tomorrow I will, but not tonight. No, and what would 14 be?
Well, 14 of that particular column would probably be in the low 80s. But again, that's in the bachelor's degree. Now, again, we have columns that go all the way up to doctorate. Okay, so like somebody who is on step 14 of a doctorate, and we do have one employee, I believe, who is there. I believe he is at somewhere in the vicinity of 105,000.
Okay.
And if I recall, when this was the one experience I had with this, we weighted heavier towards younger teachers to try to move them up
Right.
pay scale quicker so that we can retain them and
Right.
choose to stick with us. So, yeah.
And again, there is a requirement in Massachusetts that within 5 years you have a master's degree. We do have a couple of teachers that are still in the bachelor's degree column, but have more than 5 years because they're teachers who are grandfathered, because they have been in education for a long time.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Because I'm sure there are other people in the audience that have those questions, not just myself.
So you mentioned the town has 10 steps versus the school has 14. Is the 14 for the school system comparable to other towns? And
Well, you have a whole number of contracts. I don't know if they're all at 14.
Yeah, the only one that is at 14 is the teachers. I would say that I have seen teacher schedules that have as many as 28 steps.
Wow.
So 14 is pretty common. Some have 14 steps at the first few lanes, and then they will go up to 16 steps to try and reward people who get more education. Trust me, there's as many ways to construct salary contract or salary schedules as there are stars in the sky. So, but I would say 14 is pretty average.
And I see from your budget that you have quite a few who are at 14.
Yeah, we do. Probably half,
That's what it looks like.
probably about half.
So if they're at 14, where are they in the age bracket or close to retirement bracket? I don't,
14 years in.
Yeah,
Well,
14 years.
yeah, they're typically 14 years in.
14 in?
So depending on whether or not they have prior teaching experience, and depending on when they choose to retire, 20 years is usually the minimum that somebody will put in before they retire. 30 is a very magical time, because you really get a big bump in retirement.
if you can
and-
last that long?
If you can last that long, that's right. So, I'd say that they're about halfway through, usually.
Those are my questions.
So just for recapping, Craig, so with the 65-35 split, basically for years, we've effectively been funding capital projects strictly out of free cash
Right.
and borrowing as appropriate.
Yes.
That's it.
Free cash and borrowing, I think, were the two main sources, yeah. I don't think there's anything else significant.
Are there, I know with the capital planning committee having met and a lot of discussions they had, are there still items out there now that, and we've had discussions on this committee, things that might be, that have been considered capital items in the past, but they're more properly considered as operating items?
I'd love to answer that.
I thought you might have something to say about that.
There absolutely are, in my opinion. And, one of the comments that I've put here, I was kind of saving it for when there's a motion and when there's discussion. I mean, I know where I lean on this. But one of the items I was going to say is that there are absolutely items that should be discussed that are, to me, appear to absolutely be operating budget items, whether they be curriculum, whether they be vehicle leases. And that's a little bit more debatable, but it's debatable, and the debate and the discussion should be had. There are things that don't match the definition that we're using for capital items, that I think, regardless of how this goes, now's the time to put in the budget discipline that we're trying to do, and to have that discussion and to get it straight. But that also results in items migrating off of the capital lists and onto the budgets, and you'll see these budgets go up even more. You just need to be prepared for that.
And just a little history with the like the curriculum especially, that was put in because years ago, we had, that gave the town control over buying curriculum and not adding a teacher. If we added 40,000 to the budget or 50,000 to the budget, with the intent of it going towards curriculum, it had gone towards staffing. So they avoided cuts there. By putting it at town meeting vote, it restricted it so it was only usable for, so I agree, it's not capital.
Right.
But I believe there's a reason to vote it at town meeting. So it may not need on
Yeah,
town meeting.
I don't disagree.
That's, yeah, there's two aspects of it, and
So I believe maybe you have a capital items and town
Other.
meeting vote items, But either way, that, when I say capital, it could obviously go towards it.
Non-recurring expenses.
That's a
Right.
great word. And so
Yeah.
my
well, we even
funds for
have,
capital
we even have
go towards
recurring expenses that we consider capital, do we not?
Sure.
Things like, some of the equipment at the fire department, for example, where we've finally gotten on a schedule to replace equipment, and that's equipment that is required for them to do their job. And so it's, yes, it's capital, but it's an operating expenditure because it's something that they have to have on an ongoing basis. So, yeah, I get the fact that there's some things that we're going to have to vote town meeting
Right.
just because of the way the laws are. But that could still be something that's that's effectively an operating item. Where we put it in the budget, I think we can
Yeah.
work with that.
Right, the source.
And these
Right.
capital funds could be used to fund those I'm just calling them capital for this, but it could obviously be non-recurring or recurring expenditures.
Right. The only reason I asked the question initially is because I think going, and believe me, I think going in this direction totally makes sense. I'm on board with this conceptually. I just think that your starting point's important. Like, in other words, where you're starting your base from and making sure that you have the right things in there operating, be that
Right.
things that need to be added in to the school budget or the municipal side, or taken out for purposes of budgeting, the ongoing operating growth.
Yeah, and theoretically, if you would up the FY '21 starting point, I'll just pick a number, for 45,000 for curriculum, and on the municipal side, put the cruisers in, the leases on those for whatever, that would give you your starting point, and then it could still grow by 4%, because you've goosed up the starting point. It's just getting the starting point right, and that can be addressed. I'm one to try to move to getting something approved, so we can have them in next week, and that can be addressed either in FY '22 as we change the starting point, or, because we can always just add items back in, and we're not going to
Yeah.
decide on those tonight.
Right, and that's what I was going to say, is
Or I'm
actually,
not sticking around
it'd be a
for it.
good idea to use FY '21 to sort of,
Yeah.
you know, sort of hash through those,
Yeah.
those questions and adjust.
And that's my goal. If we can get an approval of the 4% plan for FY '21, with, that if we don't have enough funds, then we go to even split. The proportionally even split. And if we have more funds, just more goes into capital. We can address the starting points again in '22. And we can work on then allocating in all of the health insurance with a factor for it, all of the recurring non-capital expenditures that we want to pull off the capital schedule and bring up the budget, the starting point to the budgets for those. So I think there's work that can be done, but having a new framework within which to do that work, I think, is the key.
I tend to agree with that. Joyce?
I just want to thank Fred for all this hard work, because there was a lot of work into this.
There was, yeah.
That's a good, quick question.
So, thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Craig, do you mean to say on each of the three allocations, the bottom line there, funds for capital projects, would you also agree that that would be funds for consideration for above-level service requests?
I would, but my fear is if you start doing that, since that goes into the base for the next year, you're going to start eating into your growth.
Right.
And, if
But
somebody.
where would those above-level service requests be funded from otherwise, if they're not?
Either through cuts in the department, if it's decided that we need a guidance counselor at the school, and they have retirements, they could transfer that money over to fund that position. If we decided we needed increased hours at Council on Aging, and there's something else we could adjust, they could do that on the municipal side without any involvement from the finance.
It's
Yeah.
basically just
But then-
reslicing the
But then the
pie.
real change
Right.
of that is, if there is something that truly is an above-level service request, I firmly believe that's what Prop 2.5 is for. You let the voters decide.
My point being that is the fact that this document, which could go out, and
Yeah.
if we're not careful, we could vote on a document that says that these funds are reserved for capital projects, unintentionally tying our hands for above-level service requests, which I'm not advocating for. I am a proponent of making sure that the capital requirements of the town are also addressed in our growth. But I don't necessarily want to unintentionally tie our hands for if there is a compelling above-level service request. And maybe there's a different wording you could put there.
Yeah, and in the motion, if I make a motion tonight, I will take that into account and not call it capital. But my goal of taking it out of the operating budgets is by removing it from the operating budgets, you don't have it grow every year. And that was the key piece. That's why anything capital, tax cut, anything you do with it other than put it in
Stabilization.
operating. Exactly. And, and if we do have windfall years, it might make sense to consider putting something in stabilization and absolutely earmarking it for future year deficits. I wouldn't go into stabilization to fund a budget unless I had just put $200,000 into stabilization for future budgets. And that's all
Right.
I would ever
I think that's an appropriate use for that.
Yeah.
Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, I did, Madam Chair, thanks. My concern still is what I mentioned for the past several weeks, was that this new Glen Ellen money is going toward the school. I think we must be cognizant that there's several other developments with income coming in, and Mr. Kaczynski, the building inspector, made reference to the selectmen a few weeks ago. There's a lot of growth going on, and my concern is that money is being used that will not affect the schools at all. So, but meanwhile, a large road of Orchard Street will now be turned over, the sewer system. The municipal's going to be responsible for that. The pumping station, this massive station that's on Middlesex Street, is going to have to be taken care of at some point. That I firmly believe that I didn't think that the money was going to be Glen Ellen just for capital projects. I thought it would be a mixture of municipal service increase as a result and also capital projects. Now, there are other over 55 projects going in that will not affect the schools. One, houses are already being sold also on Acorn Street, and then the assisted living, Mr. Gazinski on Bridge Street, multi-million-dollar project that will be bringing a lot of income in as a result of that. So, and then the Tresca project was 45 homes that will be affecting the schools down the road, but that income will be coming in. And what I see, Craig, when you highlighted in yellow the houses above the 40, the 50, the 50,
Yeah.
those are strictly Glen Ellen homes?
Yeah, I was told it was going to grow
So
by 324.
has anyone considered any of the other prospective growth in the actual subdivisions that are coming in? And the 40Bs are going to be bringing money in.
I did not have data on that. I did have Carol's other additional typical new growth. So there's something factored into that, I'm sure, but I don't know that we've gone to the detail I did with the Glen. And just for a moment, as to the growth that we're getting, I would have a problem also with the 65-35 split if all the money was being divided that way. My goal through this was to try to allow for sustainability in the school, and then put the other money, and as pointed out, maybe capital is not the right word, but if it goes into anybody's budget, it will make us run out of money sooner unless we have the additional growth, but it could certainly be considered for municipal growth. I just don't think you can go less than 4% on the school without having problems there.
You talked last week, Madam Chair, about perhaps 3.5% growth. I mean, 0.5% is 0.5%. But also, I think there was discussion, is there any point where we see just what the level services, which includes the cost of living, the contracts and everything, what's the baseline?
That's what's coming in the budget right now. Those budgets are baseline level service
And
budgets.
what are the number of students coming in? Are they increasing? I've heard that they're
I
decreasing.
think the more important question is the number of classrooms, and if the classrooms are filled can you eliminate a classroom? Because just eliminating one child or 3 children per grade doesn't reduce any expenses.
No, keep it, we've discussed in level service.
Right, so you'd have the same number of classrooms.
Right.
Right, I think
What
that's
does level
that will-
service cost?
That's what will be presented when the school comes in and the municipal budgets are coming in.
I don't think we know that yet.
Yeah. And it's going to be more than 4%, or close to 4%, because listening to the last meeting we had.
Historically, what did last
No,
year?
I heard that in September you were going to be getting the final numbers of what the schools were and what was going out and what was coming in for population.
Again, that's, unless it eliminates a classroom, that doesn't change the expenditures for teachers or anything else.
Again, we're not talking about, for the third time, I'm not talking about eliminating classrooms, Madam Chair.
So your question would be,
Well, are we giving, does there come a point where sometimes you give a group too much money?
not in this town. I honestly don't think we've hit that for any department yet.
When all of a sudden, the flux of money that's coming in, all of,
Well, and I'm afraid that's what could happen, and that's why I'm trying to cap at 4%. I think that's the fear. If we stick with the 65-35, we will give too
Right,
much
yeah.
money, and that's why I'm trying to cap it. I think there's a nice balance between enough to sustain and too much. And
Yeah,
I think
I-
that,
can I-
and I hear what you're saying. If we looked at municipal growing at 4.25 or 4.5, on the idea that Glen Ellen's coming in, that's a possibility. If we do that right now, we run out of.
I mean, we have the
funds.
town administrator here. Mr. Town Administrator, do you see any increases in municipal as a result of strictly over 5 coming in? What will the weight be of that project on the municipal services?
Strictly over 55?
Yeah, the money.
Well, I think the main impacts will be certainly public safety. We'll have to address probably additional rescue runs.
Chief Barrett, that was top on his list last year.
That's a concern, and also there's been an ongoing desire to boost the senior services, and that'll continue to come into extra focus as part of that. I think those will be, the public safety and senior services will be the main
Library,
focus.
perhaps?
To some extent, the library services. So those will be the focus on the municipal side. And if I can, just for a second, talk about the revenue projections. And I know that's what these are, just,
Yeah.
kind of a snapshot in time based upon some building numbers coming in. I'm hoping we have the problem of what do we do with all the new revenues at over 4%. I am not as confident that that's going to be a problem in FY '21. I do firmly believe there will be a large bump in new growth numbers coming through. I would question whether the timing of that will come to full fruition in FY '21. I think a lot of that will be more starting in FY '22. So,
Yeah, the
although I hope I'm wrong, I hope I'm
Well-
way underestimating the speed of the new growth coming in. But I would just caution, as far as expectations for the Finance Committee, we're still working on that as far as the timing of when these funds will come in. We're still waiting to get the first revenue numbers for the marijuana facility. These are all things that will be helpful to us moving forward from a financial standpoint. I just caution the committee that these are just projections at this point, and the town will have its revenue numbers hopefully not too long into the future to be able to actually have a first pass at those numbers for the
Yeah,
committee.
the FY '21 numbers, though, they are directly from Carol's sheet that
Oh.
she handed out. The only part that changes from Carol's numbers on that is when you get to the calculation of funds available. That's when I started backing out. I just estimated a 5% increase in benefits and those type of things.
Right,
So
and
the
those-
top number, the 32,359,000 is straight off Carol's sheet.
Right, no, and I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
questioning the numbers, I'm just saying that there are other factors, as in those excluded costs that will be coming off, and the amount of those and how that'll affect the bottom line
Right.
if we're gonna hit that 4%, and I'm certainly I hope we do. There's no guarantee of that at this
Oh,
point, and
absolutely.
we're still crunching our numbers. I think, every year that goes by over the next 2 or 3 years will be better for the town. I do think FY '21 will still be a fairly tight year, where we're trying to retain the positive moves that the town has made in the past, but I don't see us being able to add too much onto that in FY '21 to the improvements that have already been made.
So, Madam Chair, how would we address the additional requests from the public safety departments as a result of Glen Ellen?
Well, right now,
Madam-
if this is 25, may I?
Sure.
Yeah. This is 25 homes going in. I mean, it's my worksheet. There's 25
No, it
homes
wasn't a
going in.
worksheet question.
Yeah, there's 25 homes going in this year. That's not going to cause a dramatic increase to public safety. 25 homes is what the worksheet says. If there's more than 25 homes, we get more revenue, and then we have an
We don't know that. Could be over 55, someone with injuries and everything that, I'm not,
Well, and we did add 2 police officers to public safety
well,
just
not to the
recently.
fire department,
Well,
though,
I know,
Madam
and
Chair.
and Kathy, that was my exact argument, that it's not going to be a police response that we need up there, it's going to be a paramedic response.
Which generates revenue.
Right, and then the ALS does, the reimbursements help cover those extra costs, but we could be in the same situation that we're in with the building inspector of not having a big enough budget. But the revenue is a lot higher, so we have to increase the expense one year, and then it kind of ratchets up every year as those runs get higher. Yes, Joyce?
I'm confused then. If we've got more 55 and older coming into the town, and they're, the mic.
If we have more 55 and older coming into the town and the Glen is bringing in the money, why isn't more of the, why aren't we concentrating on some of that, more of that money coming in from the 55 and older to go to more of the senior and more of the municipal rather than to the schools?
Madam Chairman, may I?
Yeah, you
What-
can.
what I-
I'm only asking because I've been asked.
What I was looking at, a 4% is probably the sustainable number.
Right.
So I wasn't going to penalize the school for them coming in, I was going to hold it level. If we want to consider 4.25% increase for the municipal side instead of 4, grow the school by 4, municipal 4.25 for that reason, that would just make less money available for capital projects. And that would, 4.25% would probably bring in 30,000 more, 40,000 more in this municipal side. If that was needed for senior center, our salaries, our senior center cost would be about that of Walpole, and they're open 40 hours a week. So we would almost be able to double we'd need about 50,000 to double our senior center hours. But that puts $32,000, $34,000 towards that.
So the way that I've been kind of looking at this as a framework that we're proposing that the school department and the select board adopt or consider adopting. I mean, we're not going to tell them what they need to do, but it is a proposal saying, here's one way of us all agreeing on how we're going to allocate the tax revenues going forward. Certainly, the select board may have their own ideas of percent growth rates that they may want to put different growth rates to the schools or to the town. But I see this as a way for us to say, well, we like this framework, let's work on how we're going to agree on this and tweak it and then revisit it.
I understand that, but, and I'm a supporter of the school system. It has nothing to do with it, but there's so much money. All our tax money, as it stands now, is a 65-35, correct? And it goes to, so that the schools. The senior centers, the senior 55 and older, one of the reasons that everybody was thrilled that they were coming in was because it wasn't impacting the schools. So I'm confused as to why more isn't going towards seniors and municipality versus to the schools.
I can take if I may, take a swing
You can
at
take-
that. That's how I was looking at it too, originally, especially last week when I asked that we reconsider this, that Craig go back to the drawing board and kind of add this allocation model number 3. That's exactly how I was looking at it because of the discussion we had at the tri-board. And essentially, as I understand it, we can do that all we want, but the bottom line remains that if you look at the second to bottom line of allocation 3, doing that means that in the second year, starting in FY '22 out through '25, that there will no longer be money to sustain what is not, I would say, not growth that is projected to happen regardless. In other words, then you would be forced into either cuts or an override in order to make that happen. You can spend the new growth money from the Glen Ellen on non-school budget items or capital. But if you do that, on top of that, you can anticipate it will happen. That's why I asked the question from, I believe Craig, but I also want to hear it from those people that do this full-time, not as their hobby and not as a voluntary service. This is their job. Tell us what the rates are. And they both said it's basically 4+%. So if you believe them, and you look at Craig's numbers, allocating the Glen Ellen growth money to non-school budget items means that you will run the school at a deficit because of salary increases and expense increases. That is.
But there's more development coming in that is going to have school-aged families that will be, that tax money will, I'm
That's
not
right.
trying
And our
to.
crystal ball is not such that you know what that number is. These are all just forecasts and budget models.
And Madam Chair, it's not just for the students coming in, it's actual dollars coming in from a house being sold, built. When a large 20 acres of land is subdivided, that immediately becomes taxable as individual lots.
Not necessarily. It depends on how it's structured, as we see at the Glen.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when a regular parcel, okay, I don't want to,
Well, Madam Chair, I guess when I looked at the Glen coming in, I thought that, great, there's going to be 324 homes coming in with no kids hitting the school. So I saw that 4% was, and that gave us a sustainable growth rate at the school. If those 324 homes came in with 2 children per home, we'd be looking at 8, 10, 12% increase on the school.
But
Yeah,
the-
but they didn't, yeah.
But no, that parcel would not have sustained 324 homes. It would have been half that. They were allowed to build more properties because it wasn't affecting the schools. It could have been a beautiful, what is it, 2-acre, 3-acre zoning up there? It could have been a beautiful rolling meadow, million-dollar homes. But it was chosen because of the effect that the school would have had on that.
Well,
to
I
go
guess-
this way.
I guess, do we have a proposal? Because I can entertain the idea of increasing the municipal growth slightly more once we get numbers and find out what it, what the selectmen have to say. If we moved it to 4.25 for the municipal side and 4 for the school side, I guess as long as we're not playing the zero-sum game, if we move the municipal up and drop the school below 3%, 4%, I can't get behind it. We'll starve out the teachers and we will not be able to sustain our school.
Is there
Because
any
we do-
appetite, Madam Chair, for taking the Glen Ellen money only and not all the other over 55 projects off of the table for the schools, but leave the assisted living, which is multi-million dollars, leaving
We
the
don't
gas
have-
station? Everyone's like, oh, we need another gas station. That's $1 million.
Right, but all we have in here is the typical growth rate because we don't exactly know when those other projects are going to come on board.
And just one other point
But
on
I
that.
think Mike Kuzinski, I thought that Mr. Giampietro was saying that we're going to see some activity when he was at your meeting.
We will be seeing a lot of activity, but a lot of that new growth won't hit our books until FY '22.
And that's why the 3
So it'll be
year-
built in '21, but we won't have the full, I mean, some of that will flow to free cash. The new growth that we don't collect for the budgetary part of FY '21. But a lot of this won't hit to the point where the Finance Committee has those funds to utilize as part of its budget deliberations until FY '22. So you're right, it is all coming in. There'll be a lot of activity
Right.
during FY
I want the
'21.
Finance Committee to know that there is a lot of
There is.
activity coming in.
Yes.
There is, but we can't exactly plug it in yet.
And I want to point out one really important thing. In FY '21, the 4% model is putting $266,000 towards something other than budgets. All the money from the Glen goes towards something other than budgets would only be 235. So I'm actually setting aside more money under the 4% model than we're getting from the Glen the first year. The second year, the Glen, the first 2 years of construction would bring in 620,000. I'm setting aside 447. So you're right, it's not keeping pace, but at some point, as we get better numbers and we get more information into this, we can start discussing significant changes. But for next year, 4% is actually more money being set aside and not being put in the school
Yeah.
than taking the Glen money. We grow by 4.13% if the numbers are right, if we put just the Glen money into another fund. And we're only allowing growth at 4%.
And I'm hoping that we have higher than typical growth that we'll know for the
Right.
FY '22 budget. And then we may decide that all the Glen revenue will just be set aside, and we'll use the other atypical growth for
And
for
I would
budgets.
not even call it the Glen revenue. I would say we allow municipal to grow at a higher rate than the schools because
Yeah.
of that. It's just.
Fair enough.
Then you're not
Yeah.
segregating my house, my kid leaves
Yeah.
high school. I don't have kids, where do I count? So
Right.
I just want to say, I'm absolutely.
If you're not
open-
an over 55, then you don't count as an over 55, so you know that now.
Yeah. I've heard other suggestions from other people I've worked with, but that's okay on this project. But nonetheless, what I'm saying is every year we can plug in the known new growth. And if we do get to the point where we want to put more towards municipal and grow it at 5%, because we truly do need that, and we have another huge project coming online, I got no problem with that. My goal is not to starve out the school or impede the town's growth. But if we're trying to take a small
It's no
pot
one's goal.
and divide it differently between, if I'm trying to reduce the school to 3.75 so I can increase the town to 4.25, that I object to. If I keep the school at a sustainable level and we have enough additional funds because of all these new growth, the town, I don't have an issue philosophically with it growing more because it makes a lot of sense for that. And I do see what you're saying. By the same token, if we build some large development that brings in, 50 more, 60 more families for the schools, we may be revisiting it the other
No,
direction.
those 40Bs. But you know what,
Yeah,
Craig,
yeah.
you've got a lot of history here. Now, who sets the rate? I'm hearing from our chairman that we're all going to try to all get on the same page with school versus selectmen versus the finance committee. And I was hearing from you that 20 years ago, it was the finance committee that determined the split. At the end of the day, who's going to decide this?
It's
Town
always
meeting.
town meeting.
Right.
Town meeting
Yes,
will
but
ultimately-
the select board's the one who proposes the budget, and then the finance committee is the one that makes our recommendations based on what the select board is proposing.
But secondarily, when we did the first split, we said, we're considering 65-35 because you want to grow by 80%, you want to grow by, the growth rates were insane. So we said, this is the split. What I'm saying is, we issued guidance, and we told them that's how we're evaluating it. I think if we came out with a 4% guidance, with the stipulation that if the numbers are wrong and we have more revenue, I'm absolutely eager to hear how you're going to add 10 more hours, 15 more hours to the Council on Aging. That might make sense.
For 1 year, Craig?
No,
We'll
it
do
would go-
this-
it would go-
No,
it-
we're going to do the 4% for 1 year and then review it?
Well, then, if I add, let's just take this out. If I add 50,000 for the Council on Aging in FY '21, we can go back to 4% the next year, because now that increase, that $50,000 increase is built into the new base. So that will always be funded in perpetuity. So we can play with the numbers for different years. If this year they come in with a really strong argument for Council on Aging hours, and I'm picking that one because it seems to be a good connection, or ambulance,
Or ambulance.
we could put 50,000 into the budget, and their budget would grow, instead of to 8,121,000, it would grow to 8,171,000. And then next year, 4% growth on top of that, because now you've staffed up, you've hired those paramedics, you've hired that other Council on Aging staff member. So that would be built in perpetuity, and you could grow at 4% after that, every year after that, because you funded this early stuff. Same thing with an override. If you had an override and put more money in, it would move your base up, and then every year it would grow by 4%. So those are all feasible.
But at the end of the day, you want to say to the taxpayers, we'd like to give you a little break when we can.
Absolutely.
Just because we have it, doesn't mean we have to spend it.
And I think that by setting
You know, I
aside
mean,
some of the funds
You
for
want to keep,
capital.
you want to keep the people
Excuse
that
me.
we have.
Okay. I don't want this to get out of hand, but what we're doing is setting aside funds for capital, which we haven't done in the past, and we've had to do overrides. This allows at least some of that then that free cash can be used for other things. It's a way to keep us from borrowing for everything that is coming up. That's the reason, that's what was attractive to me about this plan. Because I don't think it makes sense to spend what we've got every year. We've got it, we're gonna spend it, and then 5-7 years from now, it's like, oh, well, now we don't have it, so we have to start laying people off. Because there's a cost to laying people off, too. It's not free. So I like the evening out
Yeah.
aspect of this. Peter, you had something you wanted to say?
Notwithstanding what you just said, because it is going to be a little bit contradictory, but in the fall, we voted to add a couple of police officers. And that may be cause to adjust the percentage, as Craig described, up front during this coming year, this coming budget year, '21. There's already a cost associated with that. I'm not sure exactly what it was. It was in the, a half year, at least a half year for 2 officers, so that's 1 salary position or 1 FTE. It's not $266,000, but it's likely a chunk of that. And so that may be worthwhile to, when this is proposed, I believe next week to the tri-board, that already be considered, so that we don't have to discuss it and then back away from it to say, oh, we know we didn't anticipate what we already voted for in the fall.
The only change I would make to that suggestion is I would just move the base number up by 80,000 or whatever number is needed, and leave the 4% as the number, but that would
That's
be.
what I was thinking.
But my only problem with that is, that was my fear, that we're adding out of sequence, we're adding when
Yes.
there's no discussion, and now
Yep.
we're.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
tying
bring
our
that
hands.
up.
Yeah, it makes me angry.
It's done is done.
But then the other side, they were saying the pot money was going to pay for one of the policemen.
Yeah.
Because Dale was going to be, and the school one was going to be the marijuana money, so you want to hold them to their word,
Yeah. Yeah, and I did not include any marijuana tax money for the first year, and I didn't include any host community agreement money at all. And I took the pessimistic view that one of our selectmen possibly mentioned, I don't know who said it, but once we lose the monopoly status,
Yeah.
the revenue will come in less and less each year.
Right, every year
cannot-
there's more added on.
And we cannot appropriate marijuana money until we receive it
Right.
into the
Right.
Treasury, and we have expectations of it, but we haven't received a great deal of it. And
So
again,
there's at least a 1-year lag.
So I
Yeah,
didn't
Oh, more
build
than
anything
that.
in for FY '21.
and that's going to be the problem with trying to fund a full police officer position in FY '21, because we haven't received that amount of funds as of yet,
Right.
to be
And-
able to appropriate those
And by the
funds.
same token, we could adjust downward in FY '22. If we do receive it and decide to earmark the marijuana money, we can reduce
Yeah.
the funding allocation that way. So we can play with those starting points in the numbers. Yeah. And I think that's all on the table to do.
So are we going to take a vote?
All right, yeah,
Want me to make a motion on it?
yeah.
I tried to craft something that took everything into consideration that's, I've been writing as we go.
Do we have something drafted specifically that sort of lays out the details in terms of, the revisiting after 3
I'll
years?
put that into the details.
Because one of the things that I'm thinking
Microphone.
about this more and more is, a lot of the discussion we've had is more about sort of little details about unknowns coming up than it is about the basic principle of this approach. And provided sufficient flexibility, which this actually looks to me like it does offer a good deal of flexibility, particularly in the early years as we begin to implement it and things get settled out. I think it's a workable solution.
Yeah.
Again, it's not set in stone. These numbers aren't, carved out here and like, that's just what they're going to be. There's a lot of both expenses and income that we really don't know and we can't really predict.
Right.
So,
All right, so this is not as you said, this is not a bylaw, this is nothing official, this is the Finance Committee's review philosophy. So we're basically sharing how we are going to review the budgets, is how I'm thinking about this. So for FY '21, the Finance Committee will allow budgets to grow by 4%, reserving the remainder of the funds to be allocated in an appropriate manner. Very loosely said there, okay? If funds are not high enough to allow equal growth for both the school and municipal budgets, funds will be allocated on an equal percentage,
At an equal growth
at an
rate?
equal growth rate.
Okay,
And that's, if they come in with higher than 4%, we've warned them. And if we have less money, we've explained what we're going to do, and if we have more money. And if somebody comes in with more than 4% with a compelling reason, we have the ability to allocate additional funds in an appropriate manner. So we haven't tied our hands, but we've given a pretty good benchmark where we'd like to see it come in.
That's good.
I think it's appropriate that we say that this is the guidance that we are adopting
Right.
to be communicated to all of the town departments, including schools.
Right.
May I make just a clarification or suggest a clarification, is that anytime you say growth rate, that you specify whether you're talking growth of expenses or growth of revenue, because
Yes.
this is where the two models differ. The 65-35% principle that we've been operating on our last 20 years is based on the growth of the revenue, or the split of revenue growth. We're actually talking about changing to a 4% increase in the expenses.
Right. A budgeted growth rate of 4% on expenses.
Yeah.
Correct. Because when you're talking growth, you're not being specific enough in
Right.
clarity. With
you.
clarity's sake, I think it's important that we
Yeah.
And this is just an
distinguish.
internal policy for us. It can be revisited every year. In fact, it should be revisited every year. For FY '22, I will plug in,
4%
somebody
is
can
fine.
plug in, whoever can plug in the new growth coming in that year. We can see what it looks like. If it's better or worse, we can then change percentages as we see fit.
And I think that if we do adopt this down the road and we start putting money into stabilization, we're going to have to revisit our stabilization fund policy as well at that point.
I would wonder almost if we could set up some kind of subsidiary stabilization if we get serious about it, because we're putting out 400,000 or something into it, because we have a boom year, we want to be able to
Right.
track it.
Can you just read the motion again, Madam Chair? For D.
I got it written down. For FY '21, the Finance Committee will allow a budgeted expense growth rate of 4%, reserving the remainder of the funds to be allocated in an appropriate manner. If funds are not high enough to allow for equal growth for both the school and municipal budgets, available funds will be allocated on an equal percentage basis. Didn't write the last sentence.
Was that a motion?
Yes.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded for the Finance Committee to recommend the adoption of a internal policy that, as just stated.
Oh, come on.
Further
say it.
discussion. I'm not gonna, yeah, I will butcher it, and then it'll be two differing motions, yeah.
I'm only kidding. Yeah.
Further discussion.
No.
I'd like to poke at the 4% a little bit, just trying to understand it. So when you say the expenses are growing by 4, I understand the cost of living increases for the teachers and all that. The rest of the expenses for the school would be electric, heating, blah, blah, blah. Generally, cost of living isn't 4%. So why would it be 4% overall? I get maybe 4% for the salaries because of the steps and the lanes and all that, but overall expenses, I don't think my household expenses go up by 4% every year.
No.
So that doesn't,
I'll let the two people
Sit
that
well.
live with it, edit it out.
Just to put it in perspective, the current year, I think our salaries are 13.3, and our expenses are like 2.5 or something like that. And I've got those numbers a little off, but basically about 85% of our budget is salaries.
okay.
And then the other thing that affected us, again, this is hopefully an aberration and will begin to stabilize, but the new Clyde Brown School, while it's very energy efficient, is also much bigger, and the energy costs are somewhat more expensive than the old Clyde Brown, because it was, albeit it was older and it was inefficient, it was also smaller.
But that would be part of the new baseline.
Right.
Well, we're
So,
going
Right,
to use the
should be.
FY '20 voted budget as the baseline at this moment. We could decide to change that, to add the
Yep.
police in or whatever, as we discussed that
And
more.
Madam Chair, if I could add one more thing, and one thing that's not always considered, and this affects both the school and municipal departments, is the unfunded mandates, and those do add into that.
Yep.
I'm sure you've had a couple you've had to deal with, I know I have, and there are no magical funds that appear to help fund that. Most of the time, the state figures out ways to put those upon the towns without having to be responsible for those. So it may only be, 0.25% a year or whatever of that impact, but it does add in to that annual increase.
And we've given ourselves the flexibility to take any extra money and award it if there is a big one that comes in or, as needed.
And there are times there's some extra services needed, and it may not be a major item like adding a whole new position, but it may be just an additional cost that a department is stressed because there is really service needs that need to be put into place, and departments try to stretch their budgets and sometimes do need a little bit extra to meet those demands. And again, those are very small pieces, but they do add up.
And again, somewhat related to that is in what we've run into in recent years is the reduction of federal grants. So for example, 2 years ago, the district received $98,000 in Title I money that's used to tutor students in reading and math. And this year, we're receiving under 50. And that's just one grant. We've received reductions in virtually all of our federal grants over the last 3 years.
Right, and that highlights what we keep harping at, or at least I do, that we want to see the full
Right.
budgets, including grants from every department.
Yep.
The school, I know it's in your budget binder. But for every single department, what are the grants that are being used to fund their operations as well? Because when they go away, it's back on us to fund them.
Or cut the service.
Or cut
Or
the
cut the
service.
services.
Right. And, you know, I think it's every taxpayer's benefit to understand how all of that works.
May I ask a quick question? What's the split between, on the municipal side, between personnel and non-personnel costs?
It's not quite as stark as the schools. That's an excellent question. I know it's probably more in the 65-35 sort of area, but I'd have to check on that to give you an exact percentage. The school is definitely a higher percentage of staff costs
Thank you.
than the town.
65 staff, 35.
Correct.
Yep.
The
There
salt
are-
shed.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
are certain, like, public works and other costs
Yeah.
that we are just larger on the municipal side than
Materials.
they are on the school side.
Yep.
Thank you.
And more buildings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
I have one more. So, does this include, like, debt falling off in the future? I don't even know whether we have any falling
Yeah,
off. To Kathy's point before about, it would be nice to take some of the revenue and give, relief to, people, considering that our rate now is probably one of the highest in the state. At what point can we do something like that? Or is debt automatically like
The school,
bad because of?
the school debt, the excluded debt, as it falls off, it will reduce the rate, because we can only charge enough to cover the excluded debt. And that's the police, fire, library, school, the big four. The other debt is non-excluded debt. That's money where we just used available cash to borrow. We're paying it back out of available funds. And that right now is at 787,000, or at least it was when I looked at last year's. And I just assumed that it was going to drop 3.3% a year based on a 30-year note, and that's just a wild guess. If it's going to drop by at least that every year, that'd be worst case. And that falls off every year. That does help us out. Now, if we were to go out and buy a new fire truck or something in year 6 and add $800,000 to it, that would change the complexion on it. But we'd
But that would be voted on
at town meeting, but
yeah.
it would not be excluded debt. We would basically take money that we could otherwise use for budgets and use it towards a fire truck or something. And I don't think we need a fire truck. Yeah.
Right. Historically, what's happened here and happens in most similar situated communities is you do have, usually a large part of your debt is excluded debt, so it's the Prop 2.5 debt exclusion. And then usually you have a smaller debt package that's non-excluded debt, and that debt, usually as it falls off, the town would have a capital program, and certain items would be put back on. So if you had a year where 150,000 of annual payments was dropping off, you might get a 10-year bond for $1 million to deal with a lot of capital items, of smaller capital items that are grouped together. I think the town did that about 3 years ago on a set of items. So that's sort of how that's done. I mean, and that is a policy decision of the town. The town may choose to, no, we're going to let that non-excluded debt fall off, and we're either going to put that into operations, or we're going to lower the tax rate. I mean, and that's a decision that's made by these policy bodies and ultimately town meeting.
So it was like buying the DPW equipment, some major 10-wheelers and stuff
Right.
was a few years ago, and
Right, I think it was like $600,000, and that was put on like a 10-year bond.
Right.
And that'll fall off, after 10 years, that will fall off. And then the town will have a decision whether, again, how that available revenue now gets utilized moving forward.
Well, it's not available.
Well, it's expenses that have been freed up, so that you now have revenue coming in that doesn't have a set requirement.
into-
It's no longer required, that revenue is no longer required to be paid for that, so
Yep.
the town has a decision on what to do with that revenue capacity.
Now, Craig, has there ever been a time like when we've paid a loan off early?
Yeah, we did
I thought so,
we did
yeah,
the original Clyde Brown a few years early. Just-
yeah. If
start
it
a
was
new one.
high and there was money and stuff.
Yeah, we've paid off a few loans early, but it's not the norm typically. All right, so.
Okay, the motion.
Yeah, there's a motion on the floor. Any further discussion on the motion? All right, I'm gonna call the question. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
I'm going to hide options 1 and 3.
Yeah, no, Craig, thank you so much
Yeah,
for putting
really,
all of
Craig,
this
thanks.
together. Having it in front of us was hugely helpful in understanding the ramifications of different scenarios and also helping to narrow our focus on where we have questions, where the variables, the large variables lie. So thank you very much for all the time you put into this. I really appreciate it.
Madam Chair, when do we get the school budget? Have they voted yet, or?
It,
Oh, okay. I thought they had.
usually
it's
toward the end.
mid-March, I
Okay.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know
I
the
had-
municipal has to have theirs.
You're just
in by
working
now.
on when everyone gets scheduled. We talked about it, but I forget exactly.
And they usually come in for one night of, here's the budget, and another night of now you've had a chance to sleep on it and look at it.
So you
Yeah.
get it one night, like, fresh?
Well,
You don't
you
get
can
it a
pick it
week
up-
in advance? Oh, you can?
We got it a few days ahead
Yeah.
of time, but,
Yep.
but quite honestly, after you ask the first round of questions over 2 hours, you'll leave thinking there was stuff I should have asked, and the next round is quicker.
Yeah, usually there's specific questions that we have, and a lot of times it has to do with priorities. You know, you have a $100,000 thing on here, we don't have 100, what's your next priority?
Like a Christmas list?
Well, you know, we have to be realistic with what we have. The next item on our agenda is the minutes from our Wednesday, February 12th meeting.
I vote that we approve the minutes.
That you weren't there at?
Bold move, not being here.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, that's right.
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes.
I was
of,
here in spirit.
No, February 12th.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve the minutes from our February 12th meeting. Discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, motion carries. Any other business that we need to, yes?
I just have a question. Was next week considered a tri-board meeting or a finance committee meeting?
Invite guests.
I think we had said it was a finance committee meeting with invited guests. Since I'm the chair of this meeting, that's what I'm going to call it.
Yeah.
I think considering we're going to have the other board members here, the other boards, let's just focus on that next week, and then we'll start doing the budget meetings. I mean, I'm hoping that Mike can share some insight on the budgets next week.
Yes.
A little bit?
Well, you have your.
We have our
We have
book,
our packet.
yeah.
But probably, when you say information, what?
I'm talking broad strokes of,
Okay.
and-
I know that I'll be having my first opportunity to sit down with the finance director next week.
I'm at
and go
22%,
through
so
all
I don't know how much time
all
left.
the revenue estimates we currently have.
Thought you were
as well
FY
as the budget
32.
request. There's still a few pieces missing. We don't have our numbers from the DNC yet.
yep.
What you get.
I'm expecting to get the tri-county.
The
So
ton of money
we'll
coming in.
I'm hoping to give you more information next
Just
week.
for the
Okay.
Probably not a full revenue projection
Right.
next week.
I'm thinking,
After that.
I'm thinking like a 10, 15 minutes, you know, just broad strokes of, you know, what we're looking at, what are the things that we need to focus on, or that you're focused on for this budget season.
Well, I mean,
Just to get us in the mood, you know.
certainly, Karen and I plan on, sticking around later in the meeting to talk a little bit about that next week if you want, after the broad.
I think it might be helpful maybe in the beginning, and then we go into our discussion, if that's possible for you to schedule.
10 minutes, not 10 and 15, but we'll.
Okay. I was trying to put some boundaries on it, so,
Are they happy?
yeah, yeah.
You made it sound like you.
Okay, that'd be great.
I think they're okay with it. Sorry.
Yes?
You may have already covered this in a previous meeting, because I know I missed last week, but did anybody else get this Registry of Deeds?
Yeah.
Preservation Community Act?
Yep.
How does that affect us?
It's just informing
all.
you.
It's just informing us of the funds that are coming into the town from the deed transfers, right? Or from tax, yeah,
It's
CPC?
the CPA funds,
CPA funds.
They're earmarked funds for conservation.
yeah.
Conservation.
Okay, so we
space.
have that
Yeah.
accounted for as far as revenue for,
Yeah.
Then the
comes-
CPA, there's a motion at town meeting of how to allocate.
Yeah,
Those
it's highly
funds.
restricted funds, so it doesn't help the budgets any. It's got
so
to
does
be.
this happen every year?
Yep,
Is that-
It's telling you what you paid.
Paid.
On your tax bill.
Yeah.
Into the CPC fund.
It does not answer why you're receiving it at home every year.
This is the first year for me, so.
Because you're on
it's
the-
because you're on the
Yeah,
finance
yeah,
committee.
Yeah. It's their way of saying, look at all the good we're doing.
Yeah,
It's a nice chunk of change
Yeah.
that's in there now.
yeah, but we've been able to do some really good projects with it and look forward to additional projects. I mean, when they started on Niagara, it wasn't so good, and it's looking pretty nice
Yeah,
now.
it is.
35,000.
Yeah. All right,
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
it's been moved and seconded to adjourn. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Is that your
Opposed?
plan?
We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. All right, 5 minutes early.